If you think politics are controversial and divisive, just try talking about a DC Multiverse release from McFarlane. I've even heard of couples getting divorced over DC Multiverse reveals, like entire families being torn apart. I'm joking, obviously. No, not really. I've never heard of something like that, although that would be pretty crazy. But it does get pretty heated. People, for the most part, either hate DC Multiverse from McFarlane or they absolutely love it. And today we're probably going to be talking about maybe the most controversial wave that McFarlane has ever released. And that's not, being dramatic. It literally feels like that. People are either on one side of the fence or the other. There are rarely people that are okay with a particular release. And today we're going to be talking about something along those lines. We're going to be taking a look at the DC Multiverse Justice League Task Force wave. Really interesting. It's based on a video game from like the mid 90s, and I was tiny. I had a little tiny reptilian T-Rex brain. I can hardly remember stuff from that time frame. I do remember stuff from like early 2000s, and I think I might have played this video game way back then, but I have the memory of like a goldfish. I honestly couldn't say with certainty whether I played this video game, but I think it's irrelevant. I don't necessarily think that you have to be a fan of the source material to really appreciate this wave. And I will say there's a huge portion of the community that's complaining, at least in my personal opinion, for absolutely no reason. This is one particular wave. It does have that like 16-bit effect shading all over the action figures, but it's just one wave. Like, this isn't something that McFarlane does consistently. At least I don't remember him doing a lot of shading within the DC Multiverse wave. I know he's done stuff with the DC Direct that has like a little bit of shading to replicate the animated series, but at least from the DC Multiverse, I don't necessarily remember this being a thing. And if it has, it's like a 1 in 100 type of situation. I don't feel like people are being just when it comes to criticizing McFarlane for something like this. It's not something that's consistent. We're probably not going to see it for quite some time, and I don't think it's the end of the world. If this is up your alley, then you can pick up this particular wave. It does also include a Build-A-Figure that you can put together to have a Darkseid. And I'll reiterate, I know there are a lot of people out there that are going to criticize McFarlane because we still have yet to receive like that classic Darkseid iteration. I know we have the superpowers version, and then now this video game adaptation, and give it to McFarlane when it comes down to giving us really obscure source material, but I like it. He's doing the deep dives. It's not something that a lot of OMs do. They'll usually give you like thousands of different versions before they start doing deep dives. McFarlane started right off the bat. He was giving us like modern day comic book renditions. He was giving us like, Dark Knight Returns, Last Night on Earth, so on and so forth. He didn't stay with like the mainstream franchises, and that's really cool. So I don't feel like people are being really just to him, and we know Darkseid will eventually get like multiple different versions. He's already giving us two. I think we'll eventually get like a classic color palette for Darkseid. I will say my perfect like mind's eye representation of Darkseid is closer to, I want to say, Rebirth. I think that's the era that I'm looking for. He's a little bit like sleeker, not super thin, but he's definitely sleeker. Not quite the Zack Snyder rendition, but definitely not this bulky, massive Darkseid. I want him to be a little bit sleeker, not as wide and not as thick. At least that's my representation. I veer closer to like the Rebirth era, and that was where I really jumped into the DC line as a whole, or the DC comic book universe. But this is really cool. You get that 16-bit shading on all of the action figures. They all come with those little like video game fighting effect pieces that you can port on. I'm assuming they go ported into the fist or onto the fist, so they can look like they're in some really cool action poses. And it's pretty accurate to the source material. If I remember, I was looking up some screenshots online, and yeah, they did have stuff like that. I think that's across the entire wave. And we'll start with Aquaman, I guess. I don't know what the hate on this particular head sculpt is, and I completely get it. I mean, there are people out there that are losing their minds because of the hair. A lot of people are making jokes like, hey, there should be like a can of hairspray as an accessory, or maybe a hair dryer. I don't know. Look, I get it. It's a little bit outlandish. It's kind of like a very specific style, and it looks like it belongs in one comic book panel. I don't think this is like something that you would see consistently. But I will say, it's the first time that we've gotten a head sculpt like this. So I think it makes sense, right? If this was a consistent thing from McFarlane where we were getting hair with way too much action consistently, then I would completely get the gripe. But it's the same situation as the Wave. It's a one-off. You're not going to see this consistently. It's not going to be coming back. This is a really cool head sculpt for an Aquaman. I'm sure the head sculpts are interchangeable, and if they're not, it's not the end of the world. Like I said, this is only one head sculpt that we've gotten in this style from McFarlane when it comes down to Aquaman. It's cool, it stands out, and most Aquaman should be posed in like a really cool generic dynamic pose rather than him just kind of chilling and, you know, just kind of sitting back. This makes me want to pose him in something a little bit more iconic, you know, like a little scene that flows a little bit more. I have no problem with it. And those people that are losing their minds over it, you may be overreacting just a little bit. It's one head sculpt. There have been many other Aquamans with generic head sculpts. This one's going to stand out in the display. Next up, we have Flash with the exact same effect pieces, but I will say I like the semi-fisted hands for Flash. I'm so tired of like the open palmed running hands. There's only so many different poses that I can use for those hands. I want Flash to be in some battle poses. I don't feel like Flash is always running around. Like from time to time, he will throw some fists. And so it makes perfect sense, even though I think it's a fist and a trigger finger hand, which makes no sense for Flash. But they are semi-fisted, and it just gives you more options when it comes down to displaying these figures on your shelves. I will say I would have loved for him to reuse those really cool like lightning effect pieces that Flash always comes with. You can usually like pour them on in those little tiny holes around his body. It makes perfect sense to have used that for this particular figure, although I'm assuming that it probably wasn't accurate to the source material. But still, it would have been a really nice touch, especially considering most of these figures, or at least the first two that we've mentioned, only come with those little video game effect pieces, nothing else aside from the Build-A-Figure pieces for Darkseid as well. This is probably the figure that I'm the least excited about. I don't like the cell shading on the forehead. It makes it look really weird, but at least it's consistent with the Wave, and it's definitely a must-have if you want to, you know, actually complete the Darkseid figure. Unless you want, you know, Darkseid to have no torso, which wouldn't make sense. But I will say, if you're already invested in this particular franchise or in this video game, or if you just like the aesthetics of this particular Wave, it would just make sense that you pick up every single figure to complete Darkseid. Otherwise, I guess it wouldn't make a lot of sense to have just one like cell shaded or 16-bit cell shaded figure in your display, but to each their own. Next up, we have the Superman figure. Again, the same effect pieces, but we are getting a wired cape. It looks beautiful. It's going to display incredibly well. And I know a lot of people wish that this particular Superman would hit the barber because they don't love that hairdo, but I'll repeat what I said about the Aquaman. I like the fact that they're going different here. I mean, technically they're not straying from the source material. They're sticking to what he looked like in the video game, but I like the fact that this particular Superman would definitely stand out in your display. There are a lot of people out there that love to complain about the DC Multiverse just being Batmans and Supermans, but at least give them credit for mixing it up when it comes down to these characters. Yes, they're consistently giving us Batman and Supermans and even more than our fair share of Jokers, but at least they're giving us different source materials. They're giving us different looks, and so everybody can be happy. You know, they've done so many different movie adaptation Batmans. You have the newer Reeves Batman. You have the Christopher Nolan universe. You have the Last Night on Earth. You have the new Zack Snyder universe as well being represented in action figure form. So at least they're varying it, and I love this Superman. It's not like my prototypical version of Superman for sure, but I do remember him having long hair or being portrayed with long hair, in a number of different series or just comic book runs. And so even though this isn't like my era, but I do remember this being a thing, like, certain versions looking like he has somewhat of a mullet or just really long hair. I like it. It's all about variations, and this one is, I think, a perfect example of that. And then finally, we have Batman, and I love the head sculpt. I know a lot of people are going to criticize this as well, but this is kind of like the angry father face. I love it. If you're a father, you can relate to this type of emotion or this type of facial expression. But I said this at the beginning. I said it with Aquaman. I'm saying it with Superman. I like the fact that the face sculpts are a little bit outlandish. They're different. They're not going to fit into every single display or every single aesthetic, but the entire wave is kind of an outlier. It's something different. It's something innovative and fresh, and I absolutely love this particular Batman. It also appears that the Wired Cape is going to be pretty consistent across all of the action figures released from McFarlane, or at least the DC Multiverse, that have capes. I personally believe this is a genuinely phenomenal idea. I think it adds so much, you know, even just having a figure or a Batman or a Superman in an upright pose with the cape blowing in the wind, it just adds another layer to your figure. Not to mention, if you do get into some crazy poses, the cape can complement that particular pose just a little bit more. I believe the first appearance Batman was my personal first experience with the Wired Cape from McFarlane, and I absolutely loved it. It may be my favorite Batman of all time up to this point, and I think the Wired Cape has a lot to do with it. And then, since I'm already here, I might as well talk about 3 bonus figures that I just recently saw went up for pre-order. We do have that Swamp Thing from Planet Ran, or Ron. I'm not really too familiar with this storyline or story arc, but it looks really cool. It's aesthetically pleasing. I think they're adding like a little extra chest piece or an overlay to this particular figure compared to the original Swamp Thing. I'm going to assume that everything else is, at least to a certain extent, reuse, but that's okay. They've reused that figure quite a few times without really adding too much to it. I think some of them were like glow-in-the-dark versions, or I think one of them had like an extra head sculpt or a different head sculpt, which is like a GameStop exclusive. And now they're giving us like alternate versions or iterations of Swamp Thing, and I'm okay with it as long as it's, you know, adding value to the display. You also have the Clown from the Spawn universe. This is the Blacklight Walmart exclusive edition. You know the drill here. It's the exact same thing as the original, just in a different paint scheme. I could be wrong, but I think the only real difference is that light up feature. I think that's really the only real reason that you would pick this up. It displays really well. I've seen a lot of the figures that have been released in this paint deco, like the Mr. Freeze, look really well in display, but you are going to be paying quite a bit of a markup usually for these figures. So if you're interested, that's a viable option for you. And then finally, we are receiving one more Batman, which is based on Detective Comic Books number 587. And from my understanding, it's supposed to be based on just the cover art. I'm not 100% sure, but it will come with an extra hard cape as well as a really cool base where you can display your Batman action figure. It also has an interchangeable cloth cape. It does come with some extra really cool accessories, and I have to say, I know there are a lot of people complaining about the paint for this particular Batman. I think the colors are supposed to be a little bit lighter, but I like these type of deluxe setting Batmans. We usually don't get stuff like this: an extra display base, an extra cape, some extra interchangeable hands. It's all a part of the packaging, and personally, I like it. It's adding a little bit more value, and there are people out there that don't just want a generic regular DC Multiverse Batman with like a couple of extra hands. Like, they want extras, and this is a perfect opportunity for you, especially if you're into classic comic book or Batman comic book covers. This is right up your alley. So there you guys have it. Like I said, I'm not really going to dive too deep into those 3 figures, but those are just a few extras that we should be receiving, and I believe all of these are up for pre-order if you guys are interested. As always, this is just my personal opinion, my personal take on the DC Multiverse line. I am actually really enjoying the last few releases, and this video game little wave that builds a Darkseid, I think, is an absolute genius idea. But let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, stay safe out there and enjoy the hobby. That's the most important part of all this. And I'll see you guys in the next one.